And good evening. This is Nye County, and I'm Tom Gibson, your host, and my co-host is Chuck Augustine. And we're here tonight to talk about a lot of things that are near and dear to our hearts, in particular gun control and why we should try to avoid at all costs anything remotely considered to be gun control.
I think this is one of these ridiculous conversations we're going to have. That's only ridiculous because somebody wants to take away guns from people who need to protect themselves. And going back to when I was 19, I always carried a gun my whole life. And I was going to University of Colorado, and Nebraska, where Tom went, were in town for a football game, and I had a 32 in my car. I lived at the campus, actually, and it was renowned for people getting into fights and that when the football game was in town. And sure enough, I got run off the road by about 4 big old Cornhuskers who were going to probably, just mess with me, push me around and all that. And they were way bigger than me, and I had my gun. And they saw it, and they said, "Oh, have a good day." And it just makes sense that people should be able to use something to protect themselves.
Right, but there's 2 reasons to have a gun. Okay, one is for self-defense and defense of others, but the other, which people always seem to miss, and that's really the more important one, is to defend ourselves from a government, this government, because the government we started off with, back in 1789, is not the government we have today, and it's not even close. And our rights that were considered to be sacrosanct at that time have been stepped all over or reinterpreted, and all this BS you hear years ago. I can't remember which liberal it was on the Supreme Court that said that the Constitution is a living, breathing document. That is wrong. It's not. It was. If you start saying that it's living and breathing, you can change it at will. It has to be static. It has to be in stone, and it can't be subject to wild interpretation, which for years was going on and on with the courts in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Yes, there are courts that make terrible mistakes and decisions, like the Dred Scott decision and Brown versus Board of Dred Scott and the separate but equal doctrine when it came to education, and Brown versus Board of Education set that aside, and the separate but equal is no longer fair, because it isn't. But at the same time, because there's no such thing as separate but equal, once you make it separate, it's no longer equal. Otherwise, it would be the same. Right. So, therefore, we need to stay on top of our constitutional rights, and one of the best ones to stay on top of is the Second Amendment. The First and Second Amendment are really the 2 most important, and that's why they were the first 2 that the constitutional framers came up with, because by insistence of the states' rights people mainly. Well, go ahead. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and by the way, today is the anniversary of New Hampshire signing the Constitution.
First in freedom.
Yeah, and it was in 1788 when they ratified it.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, that was Connecticut. Go ahead.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
Was it?
I think it was. I think Connecticut was the first to sign.
Anyway, they were the 9th, New Hampshire, and that tipped it, so that it was ratified. So anyway, I went through the internet and looked up a bunch of stuff. Now, again, facts are only facts because, people accept them as facts. It's all perceptions and agendas and all the rest. But to me, when I look at a fact and bounce it against common sense and what I've seen through my life and recently and all the rest, it makes it believable or not believable. Anyway, according to this data, as of 2010, there were 300 million firearms owned by civilians in the United States. Of these, about 100 million are handguns. And I have a breakdown of the percentages of male, female, white, and all this stuff. Republicans, 41% own a firearm. Democrat, 23%, and Independent, 27%. Now, this is going back to 2010. And of course, the number of handguns, if you believe the data recently, certainly in the last couple of years, has skyrocketed.
Well, and thanks to Obama, there's been more gun sales over his tenure than I think in the history of mankind, I believe.
And again, how are you going to stop this? You know, how are you going to ever, without just totally creating a police force unlike ever was seen, even in Nazi Germany? You can't get 300 million plus firearms out of the hands of people, and if you do, it's going to be the people that need them. It's
Right.
not going to be the people, the criminals and the druggies and all this stuff. The cartels aren't going to abide by some constitutional amendment that does away with guns.
Right.
So it's just, to me, absolutely absurd.
Oh, I was just was it last night or the night before, I was on Facebook, and I read this posting, and it said this is a group was talking about their food bank, and that they were talking about how successful it was, and I was going to comment on it. I stopped myself, and because I was going to do the teach a man to, give a man a fish, teach a man to fish, you know, the parable.
Right,
and I said,
right.
no, I said, I got a better one. Really, instead of giving away food, so for people that some of them don't deserve it anyway, they're just too lazy to get a job and go to work, and there are certain people that are down and out and they need it. But I've seen these pantry lines for many years, and it's always the same folks there, and they don't seem to ever want to get that job because that would require getting a job. Mm-hmm. So anyway, so my thought was, instead of giving food away to people, we should, as a group, combine together, get this food, sell it, and then buy guns with it and give the guns to people who can't afford them, so we can arm these other percentages of people who aren't armed.
Right. And again, the ultimate battle, whether it be gun control or anything else, is the collectivism of the New World Order and the liberal or the communist philosophies going to win, or is the individual, the rights of individuals going to win out? And I've said a million times in radio shows and all the rest, Donald Trump is saying many, many things that absolutely, I think everybody says finally. But so did Ron Paul, and so did Ross Perot, and other
But they didn't
people.
have the money.
Well,
Or the
there
exposure.
again, to me, it's a wait and see. And I do think this is such a critical period in the history of humanity, much less our country.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's one of my topics of interest is states' rights, individual rights, and I'm anti strong federal government, because it wasn't intended to be to begin. Well, there were some that did. Even George Washington favored a strong central government. The Federalists, they wanted to have a strong control because they didn't trust the states to be able to do it right, I guess. But right after the Civil War, if you recall, there was a great influx of people that came from Europe, and they were the anarchists, okay? And they would be what is considered to be libertarians nowadays. And at that time, the anarchists were killed. They would round them up and come up with all kinds of excuses and to kill them off. And there was a great number of them in the state of Wyoming at one time, and Wyoming rounded them up and killed off a lot of them. Mm-hmm. And that was all done, they made excuses saying that they were dangerous and they were harming others. But the reality is that at that time in history, there was a sort of a new world order on a smaller spectrum in the United States, but a lot of them, it was called the Cattlemen's Club, I believe, or the Gentlemen's Cattle Clubs, something to that effect. And they were all millionaires from around the United States that were investing in mainly beef production and railroads. Mm-hmm. And so they saw these anarchists as a problem to their little niche. and they declared war on them, and they killed them off en masse.
Yep.
And but that is sort of, I mean, and they stopped that first flow of anarchism, but it's coming back slowly in small batches. And I think, I'm not saying be an anarchist, but be anti-government, because the government is not your friend. The government is not here to help you. It's a necessary evil, one, to make sure that the roads get paved or the snow gets shoveled or whatnot. But that can be done too on a municipal level or on a small.
Well, sure, and there again, everyone says, who's going to build the roads? We build them anyway. All government does is arrange it.
Right.
And in this
By
day
private
and age,
companies build it, and
Sure.
in
this day and age of computers and all the rest, communications unlike we've ever seen, our capability to retrieve the government from this monster it's become and return it to the individual, referendums, open contracts, you know, it's almost beyond belief how little we're using technology to really benefit and make a government far smaller and far more efficient.
Exactly. But I think the governments are run by a small elite class. That small elite class is what we would call the upper 1% or the New World Order, and that's and what they want to do is they want to thin out the population. Even Henry Kissinger, who was a New World Order guy, believe me, he was talking about how we have to eliminate approximately 70% or more of the world's population, and he was dead serious.
Yeah.
And so, but that makes it easier.
Around.
Yeah, and people like you and me, if we are allowed to survive, are going to be the peons that are being shoveling the manure for the upper 1%. We do anyway now, but it'll be, I think, they'll give us probably a few more rights and things to do.
We're going to go to break pretty soon. The phone lines are open. Flagman, where are you? Give us a call. Here we go.